My wife died in a sudden accident. A few days later, the notary handed me the keys to a luxury penthouse saying, "It's in your name now." She had strictly forbidden me from asking about her business trips while she was alive. I planned to sell it, but before doing so, I decided to visit. When I opened the door, I froze in shock because sitting in the living room was, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought I'd be holding keys to a life I didn't know existed." 3 weeks had passed since Ella's funeral, and I was still finding pieces of her scattered throughout our house on Maple Street. Her coffee mug sat unwashed in the sink, a faint lipstick stain on the rim that I couldn't bring myself to scrub away. The morning light filtered through our kitchen window the same way it had for 35 years, but everything felt different now. Empty. Like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to walk through the door with that familiar clicking of her heels on the hardwood floor. I was 60 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely lost. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts, cutting through the silence that had become my constant companion. Through the peephole, I saw Mr. Harrison, our family attorney, standing on the porch with a manila envelope clutched in his weathered hands. His expression was unusually serious, even for a man who spent his days dealing with wills and estate planning. "Stephen," he said when I opened the door, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver news you're not prepared for. "I have something that belonged to Ella, something she specifically requested I give to you after the funeral arrangements were complete." I led him to the living room, the same space where Ella and I had shared countless evenings watching the news, arguing about what to have for dinner, planning vacations we never quite managed to take. The leather couch still held the slight indentation where she always sat, curled up with her legs tucked under her, reading those romance novels she claimed were just mindless entertainment. Mr. Harrison settled into the armchair across from me, the envelope resting on his lap like it contained something dangerous. "Ella came to see me about 6 months ago," he began, his fingers drumming nervously against the manila paper. "She updated her will, but she also left specific instructions about certain assets that weren't included in the main document." My heart started beating faster. In 35 years of marriage, Ella had never hidden anything significant from me. We shared everything: bank accounts, investment decisions, even the password to her email. She was meticulous about transparency, always saying that secrets were the death of any good marriage. "What kind of assets?" I asked, my mouth suddenly, dry. Mr. Harrison opened the envelope and pulled out a set of keys. They were silver, modern-looking, attached to a small rectangular fob with an address printed in neat black letters: Downtown Tower, Unit 2107. Below the address, in Ella's careful handwriting, were the words, "For Stephen. I'm sorry." I stared at the keys, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "I don't understand. What is this place?" "It's a luxury apartment downtown," Mr. Harrison said, his voice gentle but measured. "Ella purchased it 8 years ago. The deed is in her name, but according to her instructions, ownership transfers to you immediately upon her death. No probate, no waiting period. It's yours now." 8 years. For 8 years, my wife had owned property I knew nothing about. The woman who couldn't keep a surprise birthday party secret for more than 3 days had somehow managed to hide an entire apartment from me for nearly a decade. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Why would she hide this from me?" Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I asked her the same question when she first came to me about the purchase. She said it was connected to her business trips, that she needed a place to stay when she was working late in the city. She was very specific about one thing, though. He paused, his gray eyes meeting mine. "She made me promise never to mention it to you while she was alive. Said you weren't supposed to ask about her work travels, that it was better for everyone if certain things stayed private." The business trips. Of course, for 15 years, Ella had taken regular trips to the city, sometimes once a month, sometimes more frequently. She always said they were for her consulting work, helping small businesses with their accounting systems. When I'd try to ask for details about her clients or what exactly she did during these trips, she'd get defensive, saying I was being controlling and that she needed some independence in our marriage. I'd learned to stop asking. "The apartment is fully furnished," Mr. Harrison continued, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "Property taxes are current, utilities are set up for automatic payment from an account Ella maintained separately. She left instructions that you should visit the property before making any decisions about selling it." I took the folder with trembling hands. Inside were property documents, utility bills, even what looked like a floor plan of the apartment. Everything was meticulously organized, just like Ella always kept her paperwork. But seeing her handwriting on documents I'd never known existed felt like discovering love letters written to a stranger. "There's something else," Mr. Harrison said, his voice dropping even lower. "Ella specifically requested that you go to the apartment alone the first time. She said there might be things there that would require privacy to process properly." Things that would require privacy. What could be in that apartment that I couldn't share with our closest friends? What had my wife been hiding that was so sensitive it required complete secrecy? After Mr. Harrison left, I sat in my kitchen holding those silver keys, turning them over and over in my palm. The metal was warm now from my touch, but they felt foreign, like artifacts from someone else's life. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Chen next door watering her garden, living her normal Thursday afternoon while my entire world shifted on its axis. I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Ella just 2 days before the accident. She'd been sitting at this same kitchen table, sorting through her mail with that focused concentration she brought to everything. I'd mentioned that we should start planning a vacation for my upcoming retirement, maybe finally take that trip to Ireland we'd always talked about. She'd looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read at the time, something between sadness and relief. "Stephen," she'd said, her voice unusually soft, "there are things about my life that you don't know, things I've been meaning to tell you." Before I could ask what she meant, her phone had rung, one of those work calls that always seem to interrupt our important conversations. She'd stepped into her home office, closing the door behind her, and when she came out 20 minutes later, she was rushing around gathering her purse and car keys. "Rain check on that conversation?" she'd said, kissing my cheek before heading out the door. "We'll talk when I get back from the city tomorrow." She never made it back from the city. The accident happened on Highway 91, just 15 minutes from downtown. The police said a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel and crossed the median. Ella died instantly, they assured me, as if that somehow made the loss easier to bear. Her car was totaled, her purse scattered across the asphalt, but somehow her phone had survived intact in the glove compartment. When I'd gone through it later, looking for contact information for her work colleagues, I'd found something strange. The last number she'd called wasn't her office or any client I recognized. It was a residential number with a local area code, saved in her contacts under a single initial, S. I'd never called that number. Part of me hadn't wanted to know who S was, afraid that learning more about Ella's secret life would somehow diminish the memories we'd built together. But now, holding these keys to an apartment I'd never known existed, I realized I'd been a fool to think I could preserve our marriage by choosing ignorance. The drive downtown took 40 minutes through traffic that seemed heavier than usual for a Thursday afternoon. Downtown Tower was one of those modern high-rise buildings that had sprung up in the business district over the past decade, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky like fingers trying to touch something beyond reach. The lobby was pristine, with marble floors that reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, and a doorman who nodded politely as I approached. "I'm here to visit Unit 2107, I said, my voice catching slightly on the words. He checked his computer screen, then looked up with a professional smile. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. Mrs. Ella said you'd be coming by. The elevators are just to your right." Mrs. Ella. Not Mrs. Stephen Harrison, not even Mrs. Harrison, just Mrs. Ella, like she was someone completely separate from our shared life, someone with her own identity that had nothing to do with being my wife. The elevator ride to the 21st floor felt like it lasted forever, My reflection stared back at me from the polished steel doors, and I barely recognized the man looking back. When had I gotten so gray? When had those lines around my eyes become so deep? Ella had always said I was aging well, that I looked distinguished rather than old, but standing there in that rising metal box, I felt every one of my 60 years. Unit 2107 was at the end of a long hallway carpeted in deep blue. I stood in front of the door for what felt like an eternity, the keys growing slick with sweat in my palm. Whatever was behind this door would change everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my wife, about myself. I slid the key into the lock. The apartment was beautiful in a way that felt completely foreign to our modest home on Maple Street. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline, and the afternoon sun cast everything in a warm, golden glow. The furniture was modern but comfortable, with soft gray couches and contemporary artwork that Ella had never shown any interest in when we'd shopped for our own home. But it was the sound that stopped me cold. Music was playing softly from somewhere deeper in the apartment, a jazz song I recognized but couldn't name. And underneath the music, I could hear movement, the soft whisper of someone walking across hardwood floors, the gentle clink of dishes being moved in what I assumed was the kitchen. Someone was here. Someone was living in my dead wife's secret apartment. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking with uncertainty. The sound stopped immediately, followed by a moment of absolute silence that made my heart pound so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then footsteps approached, quick and light, and a young woman appeared in the doorway that led to what looked like the kitchen area. She was maybe 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, and Ella's green eyes staring back at me with a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't identify. Recognition, maybe. Or relief. She was wearing a simple white t-shirt and jeans, but around her neck was a necklace I recognized immediately, a small silver locket that had belonged to Ella's grandmother, one she'd claimed was lost years ago. The young woman looked at me for a long moment, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the locket at her throat. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, with an accent that reminded me of Ella's own careful pronunciation. "You must be Stephen," she said, taking a tentative step forward. "Mom said you'd come eventually." She paused, her green eyes filling with tears that threatened to spill over. "I'm Sarah. I'm your daughter." The words hit me like a physical blow. I grabbed the back of the nearest chair to steady myself, my mind reeling as everything I thought I knew about my life crumbled around me. "Daddy," she whispered, and in that single word I heard 32 years of longing, of waiting, of hoping for this moment that I'd never even known was possible. I stood frozen in that beautiful apartment, staring at this young woman who claimed to be my daughter, my mind struggling to process words that should have been impossible. Sarah. She'd said her name was Sarah, and she was looking at me with Ella's eyes, waiting for some kind of response that I couldn't give, because my entire world had just shifted off its foundation. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through those floor-to-ceiling windows suddenly felt too bright, too warm, like it was exposing secrets that were never meant to see daylight. "I know this is a shock," Sarah said, her voice gentle but steady, like she'd rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times. "Mom told me you didn't know about me. She said it was complicated, that she'd explain everything to you when the time was right." My legs felt weak, and I sank into the gray couch behind me, the leather making a soft whooshing sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. "When the time was right?" I repeated, my voice coming out as barely a whisper. "She's been dead for 3 weeks, Sarah. When exactly was she planning to tell me I had a daughter?" Sarah's face crumpled slightly, and she moved to sit in the chair across from me, maintaining that careful distance like she wasn't sure if I might bolt for the door. "She said she was going to tell you soon. She'd been talking about it more and more lately, especially after your birthday last month. She said you deserved to know the truth before you retired, that you deserved to make choices about your future with all the information." My birthday? My 60th birthday, when Ella had been unusually sentimental, holding me close after we'd blown out the candles on the simple chocolate cake she'd made from scratch. She'd whispered that she loved me more than I knew, that she was sorry for things I didn't understand. At the time, I'd thought she was just feeling emotional about me getting older, about the changes that retirement would bring to our daily routine. "How old are you?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer from her appearance. 32. I was born in October of 1992. 1992. I did the math quickly in my head, my stomach dropping as the timeline became clear. Ella and I had been married for 2 years by then. We'd been trying to have children, going through all the tests and consultations that came with fertility struggles. She'd been so devastated each month when the pregnancy tests came back negative, crying in my arms and talking about how maybe we weren't meant to be parents, all while she was already someone's mother. "Who's your father?" The question came out harsher than I'd intended, but I needed to know. I needed to understand how my wife could have been pregnant with another man's child while sharing a bed with me every night. Sarah's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "His name is Richard. Richard Coleman. Mom met him before she married you, but she thought he wasn't ready to settle down. When she found out she was pregnant, she said she didn't want to trap him into a relationship he didn't want." Richard Coleman. The name meant nothing to me, but I filed it away anyway, adding it to the growing list of things about Ella's life that I'd never known existed. "So she married me instead," I said, the bitter truth of it settling in my chest like a stone. "She married me because I was safe, because I wanted a family, because I was the kind of man who would provide for her and her child." "No," Sarah said quickly, leaning forward in her chair. "That's not how it was. Mom loved you, Stephen. She really did. She said you were the kindest man she'd ever known, that you would have been an amazing father if circumstances had been different." If circumstances had been different, if my wife hadn't been in love with another man, if she'd been honest with me from the beginning, if she'd trusted me enough to tell me the truth about her pregnancy instead of letting me believe we were struggling with infertility together. "Where have you been all these years?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. If Ella was supporting this apartment, if she was living some kind of double life, where were you? Sarah stood up and walked to the kitchen area, returning with a photograph in a silver frame. She handed it to me, and I found myself looking at Ella, but not the Ella I knew. This version of my wife looked younger, happier, more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. She was sitting on a park bench with Sarah, who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. "I lived with my adoptive parents until I was 18, Sarah said, settling back into her chair. "Mom arranged for me to be placed with a family in Chicago right after I was born. She said it was better that way, that she couldn't give me the life I deserved while she was starting her marriage with you." The photograph trembled in my hands. "But you kept in contact." "She visited when she could. Those business trips she took to the city, some of them were to see me. After I turned 18, she helped me get into college, helped me find this apartment when I graduated. She said she wanted to make up for all the years we'd lost." All the years we'd lost. I thought about every time Ella had returned from one of her business trips, how she'd seemed different somehow, lighter but also sadder, like she was carrying some emotional weight I couldn't understand. She'd always brush off my questions about how her work had gone, changing the subject to ask about my day, about neighbors' gossip, about anything that would steer the conversation away from whatever she'd really been doing in the city. "What do you do for work?" I asked, trying to piece together this alternate life my wife had been financing. "I'm a graphic designer. I work mostly with small businesses, helping them with their branding and marketing materials. Mom said she was proud that I'd found a creative career, that I was doing something meaningful." I set the photograph down on the coffee table, my hands shaking slightly. In 35 years of marriage, Ella had never expressed any interest in graphic design or creative fields. She'd been a practical woman, focused on budgets and schedules and keeping our household running smoothly. But apparently, she'd been proud of Sarah's creative pursuits in a way she'd never been able to express about anything in our shared life. "Stephen," Sarah said softly. "There's something else you should see." She disappeared into what I assumed was the bedroom, returning with a cardboard box that looked like it had been handled frequently. The edges were worn soft, and the lid was secured with a piece of ribbon that looked like it had been tied and untied countless times. "Mom left this for you," she said, placing the box on the coffee table between us. "She said if anything ever happened to her, I should give it to you when you came to the apartment. She said it would help you understand." I stared at the box, afraid to touch it. Whatever was inside would be another revelation, another piece of truth that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Part of me wanted to stand up, walk out of that apartment, and pretend this conversation had never happened. I could go home to Maple Street, continue grieving my wife as I'd known her, and let this alternate version of our life remain buried with her. But Sarah was looking at me with those green eyes, waiting with the patience of someone who'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. I pulled the ribbon loose and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all in Ella's careful handwriting. The paper was cream-colored and expensive-looking, the kind of stationery Ella had always said was too fancy for everyday use. Some of the letters were addressed to Sarah, others to someone named Richard, and at the bottom of the box was a thick stack addressed simply to Stephen. I picked up one of the letters addressed to Sarah and looked at the postmark. It was from 3 years ago, sent to a Chicago address. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it and began to read. "My darling Sarah, I know you've been asking when you can meet Stephen, and I promise that day will come soon. He's a good man, better than I deserve, probably. But he doesn't know about you, and I've been a coward about telling him. I tell myself I'm protecting him, but the truth is I'm protecting myself. I'm afraid that if he knows about Richard, about you, about all the ways I've been dishonest, he'll leave me, and I can't bear the thought of losing both of you. He talks sometimes about his regrets, about how he wishes we'd had children together. Each time he brings it up, I want to tell him about you, want to show him the photographs I keep hidden in my office drawer. You're so beautiful, sweetheart, so smart and talented. He would love you if he knew you existed. But I'm a coward, and every day that passes makes it harder to find the words." I stopped reading, my vision blurring with tears I hadn't expected. I looked up to find Sarah watching me with an expression of profound sadness. "She loved you," Sarah said quietly. "She was just scared of losing you, of losing me, of everything falling apart if the truth came out." I picked up another letter, this one addressed to Richard. The postmark was more recent, just 6 months ago. "Richard, Sarah is asking about you again. She wants to know if you ever think about her, if you ever wonder what she's like. I don't know how to answer her questions without admitting that I never told you about her either. You probably don't even know you have a daughter. I've been thinking about telling Stephen everything. He's going to retire soon, and I can't keep living this double life forever. Maybe it's time to stop being such a coward about the choices I made 32 years ago. Maybe it's time to let everyone I love know the truth about who I really am. I'm scared, Richard. Scared that Stephen will hate me for the deception, scared that you'll be angry about the daughter you never knew existed, scared that Sarah will realize her mother has been a liar and a coward her entire life." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the letter. I set it down and reached for one of the envelopes addressed to me. The postmark was recent, just 2 months before the accident. "Stephen," I read aloud, my voice catching on each word, "if you're reading this, it means I've finally found the courage to tell you the truth, or something has happened to me before I could. Either way, I need you to know that every day I spent with you was a gift I never deserved. You loved me completely, honestly, and I repaid that love with secrets and lies. I have a daughter. Her name is Sarah, and she's 32 years old, and she's the most wonderful person I've ever known besides you. I should have told you about her from the beginning, should have trusted that your heart was big enough to love a child who wasn't biologically yours. But I was young and scared and convinced that I had to choose between the family I'd created with Richard and the family I wanted to build with you. I chose wrong, Stephen. I chose to lie instead of trust, to hide instead of hope. And now I'm 60 years old, and I don't know how to undo 35 years of deception without destroying everything I love most in this world." I set the letter down, unable to continue reading. The apartment around us felt too quiet, too bright, too full of truths I wasn't ready to hear. "There are more," Sarah said softly. "Letters to all of us, letters she wrote but never sent, letters where she tried to figure out how to fix everything she'd broken." I looked at this young woman, my wife's daughter, my almost daughter, sitting across from me in an apartment filled with evidence of a life I'd never known existed. The worst part wasn't the betrayal or the lies. The worst part was that I could see so much of Ella in Sarah's face, in her gestures, in the careful way she was trying to take care of me, even though I was a stranger to her. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she'd been holding back throughout our entire conversation. "I don't know," she whispered. "Mom said you were a good man, that you'd figure out what was right, but I don't want to lose you before I even get to know you." Outside the windows, the city was beginning to light up as evening approached. Somewhere in that sprawling urban landscape was a man named Richard Coleman, who had no idea he had a daughter. Somewhere else was my empty house on Maple Street, where Ella's coffee cup still sat unwashed in the sink, where her impression still marked the leather couch where I'd been planning to spend the rest of my retirement, grieving a woman who'd apparently never really existed. But here, in this bright apartment filled with secrets and revelations, sat Sarah, scared and hopeful and waiting for me to decide whether I was brave enough to love the family Ella had never given me the chance to choose. I spent the night at Sarah's apartment, sleeping fitfully on the gray couch while she insisted I take the space, rather than drive home in my emotional state. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ella's handwriting, heard Sarah calling me Daddy, felt the weight of 35 years of marriage crumbling around me like a house built on sand. When I woke up, Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee, moving around the space with the familiarity of someone who'd lived there for years. The morning light streaming through those floor-to-ceiling windows was harsh and unforgiving, making everything feel too real, too permanent. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. "How long have you been living here?" I asked, accepting the mug she offered me. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly how Ella always made it. "About 4 years," Sarah said, settling into the chair, across from me with her own cup. "After I graduated college, Mom helped me find this place. She said it would be good for me to have some independence, but close enough that she could visit when she was in the city." 4 years. For 4 years, Ella had been visiting this apartment, spending time with our daughter, building a relationship I'd never been allowed to be part of. I thought about all the business trips she'd taken during that time, how she'd sometimes come home with little gifts, a new scarf, a book she'd picked up at a bookstore, a bottle of wine from a restaurant she'd claimed to have discovered. I'd always assumed she was treating herself during her travels, never imagining she might be shopping for someone else. "The letters," I said, remembering the box from the night before. "There were so many of them. How often did she write to you?" Sarah's expression softened. "Almost every week, especially after I moved here. Sometimes they were long letters about her day, about you, about things she was thinking about. Other times they were just quick notes to let me know she was thinking of me. She said writing helped her feel closer to me when we couldn't be together." I set down my coffee cup, my hands still trembling slightly from everything I'd learned in the past 18 hours. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She nodded, her green eyes, Ella's eyes, meeting mine with an intensity that reminded me painfully of my wife. "Did your mother ever tell you she was going to leave me?" The question hung in the air between us, like a live wire. Sarah's face went pale, and she looked down at her coffee, stirring it absently even though she hadn't added anything to it. "Sarah," I pressed, my voice gentler but insistent, "please, I need to know." She took a deep breath, then reached for the box of letters that still sat on the coffee table. Her fingers moved through the envelopes until she found what she was looking for, a letter addressed to her with a postmark from just 3 months ago. "She didn't say it directly," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but she talked about making changes. Big changes. She said she was tired of living a lie, that she wanted to be honest about who she really was." She handed me the letter, and with growing dread I unfolded it and began to read. My dearest Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about the future lately, about what I want my life to look like when Stephen retires. He's such a good man and he deserves so much better than the half-truth existence I've given him. He deserves a wife who can love him completely without reservations, without secrets. I've come to realize that I can't be that woman for him. I love him, but not in the way he loves me. Not in the way he deserves to be loved. Richard called last week. It was the first time we'd spoken in almost 2 years, and hearing his voice brought back so many feelings I thought I'd buried. He's divorced now, finally free from that marriage that never made him happy. He asked if I ever thought about what our life could have been like if I'd been brave enough to choose him 32 years ago. I told him about you, Sarah. I finally told him he has a daughter and he wants to meet you. He wants to be part of your life and part of mine if I'm brave enough to choose differently this time. Stephen will be 65 in 3 years. That feels like enough time to prepare him for the truth, to help him understand that this isn't about not loving him. It's about loving him enough to set him free to find someone who can give him everything he deserves. The letter slipped from my numb fingers, falling to the hardwood floor with a soft whisper. I stared at Sarah, my mind reeling as the full scope of Ella's deception became clear. She hadn't just hidden a daughter from me. She'd been planning to leave me. For another man. For the father of the child she'd never told me existed. There's more, Sarah said quietly, tears streaming down her face. Letters where she talks about how guilty she feels, how she knows it will hurt you, but how she can't keep pretending to be someone she's not. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the windows that offered that stunning view of the city. Somewhere out there was a man named Richard Coleman, who'd been having secret conversations with my wife, planning a future that didn't include me. Somewhere out there was a whole life Ella had been dreaming about while lying in bed next to me every night for 35 years. Did she love me at all? I asked, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay strong. Or was our entire marriage just a performance? She loved you, Sarah said, her voice firm despite her tears. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but she did love you, Stephen. She loved him differently. She loved him first. Loved him first. The words hit me like a physical blow. I thought about every anniversary, every birthday, every quiet moment Ella and I had shared. How many of those times had she been thinking about Richard? How many nights had she lain awake next to me, wishing she was somewhere else, with someone else? When was she planning to tell me? I asked, turning back to face Sarah. About you, about Richard, about her plans to leave? Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She said after your retirement party. She wanted to wait until after you'd finished work, until you'd had time to figure out what you wanted to do with the rest of your life. She thought it would be easier for you to start over if you weren't tied down to a job and a routine. Start over. At 60 years old, my wife had been planning to divorce me so I could start over. The condescension of it, the assumption that I would just accept her abandonment and move on with my life, made my chest burn with a rage I'd never felt before. She had it all figured out, didn't she? I said, my voice bitter. My whole future planned out without consulting me. How generous of her to wait until I retired before destroying my life. Stephen, it wasn't like that. Wasn't it? I snapped, then immediately felt terrible for taking my anger out on Sarah. None of this was her fault. She was as much a victim of Ella's deception as I was. I sank back down onto the couch, suddenly feeling every one of my 60 years. I'm sorry, I said, rubbing my face with my hands. I shouldn't have yelled at you. This isn't your fault. Sarah moved to sit beside me on the couch, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something light and floral that reminded me of Ella. She was scared, she said softly. In her last few letters, she kept talking about how terrified she was of hurting you, of losing you completely. She said she'd been a coward for so long that she didn't know how to be brave anymore. I picked up another letter from the box, this one addressed to Richard, and dated just 1 month before the accident. Richard, I told Sarah about our conversation, about your desire to be a family. She's excited to meet you, but she's also worried about Stephen. She's gotten attached to the idea of him being her father, even though they have never met. She says she doesn't want to choose between the two of you. I don't know how to tell her that choosing might not be up to her. Stephen isn't going to forgive this, Richard. When he finds out about the 35 years of lies, about you, about Sarah, about my plans to leave him, he's not going to want anything to do with any of us. Maybe that's what I deserve. Maybe that's what we all deserve. But I can't help hoping that somehow, some way, there might be a future where everyone I love can be part of the same world, where Stephen could learn to love Sarah the way I know he would have if I'd been honest from the beginning, where you could be the father you've always wanted to be, where I could finally stop pretending to be someone I'm not. I know it's probably impossible. I know I've made too many mistakes, told too many lies, hurt too many people, but I have to try. For Sarah's sake, if not for ours. I'm going to tell him everything when he turns 60. That gives me 4 months to figure out how to destroy a man's entire understanding of his life and somehow convince him that it's an act of love. 4 months. Ella had given herself 4 months to figure out how to tell me she was leaving me for another man. 4 months to prepare me for the revelation that our marriage had been built on lies, that the woman I thought I'd spent my life with had never really existed. But she'd run out of time. Sarah, I said, setting the letter aside, I need you to tell me about Richard. What do you know about him? Her expression became guarded again. Not much. Mom didn't talk about him very often, and when she did, she always seemed sad. She said he was an artist, a sculptor, I think, and that he lived somewhere outside the city. She said he was passionate and creative and everything she thought she couldn't have when she was young. An artist. A sculptor. Everything I wasn't. I was a practical man, an accountant who'd spent 40 years helping other people manage their money and plan for their futures. I'd never created anything beautiful, never inspired anyone the way artists could. I was safe, reliable, boring. The kind of man a woman settled for when she couldn't have what she really wanted. Did she ever bring him here, to the apartment? No, Sarah said quickly. This was our space, mine and Mom's. She said it was important to keep some things separate until she figured out how to bring everyone together. Bring everyone together. Like we were all just pieces on a chessboard that she could move around according to her grand plan. Like my feelings, my life, my future were just variables in an equation she was trying to solve. My phone buzzed with a text message. I almost ignored it, but something made me check the screen. The number wasn't in my contacts, but the message made my blood run cold. Stephen Harrison, this is Richard Coleman. We need to talk. I know about the apartment, and I know about Sarah. Ella promised me certain things before she died, and I intend to collect on those promises. Meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Miller's Diner on 5th Street. Come alone. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking. Sarah noticed my expression and leaned over to read the message. "Oh, God," she whispered, "he knows you found us." Richard Coleman. The man Ella had loved first, loved differently, loved enough to plan a future with. The man who apparently thought he was entitled to something now that Ella was dead. The father Sarah had never known who wanted to collect on promises made by my deceased wife. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. I would meet the man Ella had chosen over me. The man she'd been planning to spend the rest of her life with while I grew old alone, wondering where I'd gone wrong. But first, I needed to understand exactly what Ella had promised him, and what it was going to cost me to keep the only family I had left. Miller's Diner had been a fixture on 5th Street for as long as I could remember, one of those timeless places with red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floors that somehow managed to survive while sleeker establishments came and went around it. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a booth in the back corner where I could see the front door and have some privacy for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. I ordered coffee I didn't want and sat there turning the cup in my hands, watching condensation form on the sides while I tried to prepare myself for meeting the man Ella had loved more than me. What do you say to someone who represents everything you never were, everything your wife wished you could have been? At exactly 2 p.m., the door chimed, and I knew immediately it was him. Richard Coleman was nothing like what I'd expected. He was tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it and clothes that managed to look both expensive and carelessly worn. There was an artistic confidence in the way he moved, a sense of someone comfortable in his own skin in a way I'd never been. He spotted me in the corner booth and walked over with purpose, sliding into the seat across from me without invitation. Up close, I could see the lines around his eyes, the weathering that comes from a life lived without the careful planning that had defined mine. He was handsome in a rugged way that probably appealed to women who wanted excitement, adventure, passion, everything Ella had never found with me. "Stephen Harrison," he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested either cigarettes or decades of laughter. "You're younger than I expected." I forced myself to meet his gaze. "You're exactly what I expected." That earned me a slight smile. "Ella described you well then. She said you were direct, honest to a fault. She said you deserved better than the lies she'd been telling you." The casual way he mentioned my wife's name, like they'd been having intimate conversations about me for years, made my chest tighten with anger I was trying hard to control. "What do you want, Richard?" He flagged down the waitress, ordered black coffee, then leaned back in the booth with the relaxed posture of someone who held all the cards. "I want what Ella promised me. What she spent the last 2 years planning before her accident interrupted everything. Which was? A life together. Her, me, and Sarah. The family we should have had 32 years ago if I hadn't been too young and stupid to fight for what I wanted." The words hit me like individual blows. Ella's dead. Whatever promises she made died with her. Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Not all of them. She made legal arrangements, Stephen. Financial commitments. She was planning to divorce you and marry me, and she set things up to make sure that could happen smoothly." "What kind of financial commitments?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, setting it on the table between us. "Life insurance policies with me as the beneficiary, investment accounts in both our names, and the apartment where Sarah lives. Ella was planning to transfer ownership to me so Sarah would have security when we became a family." My vision blurred slightly as the implications hit me. "How much money are we talking about?" $250,000 in life insurance, another $150,000 in investment accounts she'd been building up over the past 5 years, plus the apartment, which is worth about $180,000. Nearly $600,000, money that Ella had been secretly diverting from our joint accounts, money that should have been part of our retirement planning, money she'd been giving to another man to secure a future that didn't include me. "I don't believe you," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. After everything I'd discovered about Ella's secret life, this felt entirely possible. Richard opened the folder and spread documents across the table, insurance policies, investment statements, bank records, all showing Ella's careful financial planning for a life with Richard Coleman. "She was systematic about it," he said, his voice almost admiring. "Started small, moving money a little at a time so you wouldn't notice. She said you trusted her with the finances, that you never questioned her decisions about investments and insurance." He was right. I'd always let Ella handle our financial planning, trusting her judgment about everything from insurance policies to retirement accounts. She'd been so good with numbers, so careful about our future. I'd never imagined she was planning a future that didn't include me. "This is fraud," I said, picking up one of the insurance documents. "She couldn't name you as beneficiary without my knowledge." "She could if she took out separate policies on herself. Personal life insurance that didn't require spousal consent." Richard's smile was cold now, predatory. "Ella was smarter than you gave her credit for, Stephen. She'd been planning this for years." I studied the documents more carefully, my heart sinking as I realized he was right. These weren't modifications to our existing policies. They were entirely separate insurance plans that Ella had purchased on her own life, naming Richard as the sole beneficiary. "What about Sarah?" I asked. "Does she know about this?" Richard's expression softened slightly. "Sarah doesn't know about the money. Ella wanted to protect her from the financial details until everything was settled, but she does know I'm her father and she wants to meet me." "That's not what she told me." "She told you what she thought you wanted to hear. Sarah's been asking about me for years, wondering why her mother kept us apart. Now that Ella's gone, there's nothing stopping us from being a real family. The casual cruelty of his words, the assumption that I was just an obstacle to be removed, made my hands clench into fists. I'm not stopping anything, but I'm not just going to hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars because my dead wife promised them to you. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost threatening. You don't have a choice, Stephen. These policies are legal. The investment accounts are legitimate, and Sarah needs a father who can actually be part of her life, not someone she has to hide from because her mother was too ashamed of her secrets to tell the truth. Sarah has been part of my life for exactly 2 days. Before that, I didn't even know she existed. And whose fault is that? Richard's eyes flashed with anger. You were so controlling, so rigid about everything being perfect and planned that Ella felt like she couldn't tell you about her past. She said you would have judged her for getting pregnant before marriage, would have made her feel ashamed of having a child out of wedlock. That's not true, isn't it? Ella said you had very specific ideas about how families should work, about what was proper and respectable. She said you would have seen Sarah as evidence of her moral failure rather than as a person worth loving. The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth to it. I had been traditional in my views about marriage and family. I had believed in doing things the right way, the proper way. But I would never have punished a child for the circumstances of her birth. I would never have turned away from Sarah because of choices Ella made before we met. Would I? Even if that's true, I said, my voice tight with emotion, it doesn't give you the right to steal money that should be part of my inheritance. I'm not stealing anything. I'm claiming what Ella promised me, what she set aside for our future together. Richard gathered up the documents, sliding them back into the folder. But I'm willing to be reasonable about this. What do you mean? I'll give you 1 week to contest these policies legally. Hire a lawyer, file whatever paperwork you need to file. But when you lose, and you will lose, because everything Ella did was completely legal, I want you to walk away from Sarah's life. Let her have a real father, someone who can be there for her without making her feel guilty for existing. The ultimatum hit me like a punch to the chest. Fight for money I probably couldn't win or lose the only family I had left. And if I don't contest the policies, then we can work something out. Maybe you can still be part of Sarah's life in some limited capacity. Uncle Stephen instead of Daddy. A family friend who visits occasionally and sends birthday cards. Uncle Stephen. A supporting character in my own daughter's life while Richard stepped into the role of father that should have been mine from the beginning. Sarah gets to choose, I said firmly. Whatever happens with the money, whatever legal battles we have, Sarah gets to decide what kind of relationship she wants with both of us. Richard's smile was confident, almost pitying. Of course she does. And when she meets me, when she sees what a real father can offer her, I think we both know what choice she'll make. He stood up, tossing a $10 bill on the table to cover his coffee. 1 week, Stephen. Either contest the policies and lose everything or accept the reality of the situation and maybe salvage some small role in Sarah's future. After he left, I sat in that diner booth for another hour, staring at my cold coffee and trying to process what had just happened. Richard Coleman wasn't just claiming Ella's money, he was claiming her entire legacy, her love, her future plans, her daughter. Everything that should have been mine by right of 35 years of marriage. But the worst part was the nagging voice in the back of my mind, the one that whispered he might be right. Maybe Ella had felt trapped by my expectations, constrained by my traditional values. Maybe she'd been afraid to tell me about Sarah because she thought I would judge her, reject her, make her choose between her past and her future. Maybe I'd been such a rigid, controlling husband that my wife had felt compelled to live an entire secret life, rather than trust me with the truth. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. How did it go? Are you okay? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. We need to talk. I'm coming back to the apartment. As I drove through the city traffic, I tried to prepare myself for the conversation I was about to have. I needed to tell Sarah about Richard's claims, about the money Ella had set aside for their future together, about the choice I was being forced to make between fighting for what was legally mine and risking the loss of the only real family I'd ever had. But first, I needed to understand something that had been bothering me since my confrontation with Richard. If Ella had been so systematically planning to leave me, if she'd been moving money and setting up insurance policies for years, why had she kept writing those letters about her guilt and fear? Why had she seemed genuinely torn about her plans, rather than simply executing them? And why, in all those letters I'd read, had she never once mentioned anything about Richard being entitled to money that came from our joint accounts? Something about Richard's story didn't add up, and I was going to find out what he wasn't telling me. When I got back to the apartment, Sarah was waiting with the box of letters spread out across the coffee table, organized into neat piles by recipient and date. She looked up at me with anxious green eyes, and I could see she'd been crying. "I've been reading more of the letters," she said. "Stephen, there are things about Richard that Mom was worried about, things she never told me before." I sat down beside her, my heart already sinking. "What kind of things?" Sarah picked up a letter dated 6 months before Ella's death. She was starting to have doubts about him, about whether he really wanted a family or just wanted the financial security she could provide. She handed me the letter, and I read it with growing alarm. "Sarah, I need to be honest with you about something. Richard has been asking a lot of questions about our financial situation lately, about the apartment, about my insurance policies, about what kind of inheritance I might leave behind. At first I thought he was just being practical, thinking about our future together, but something about his interest feels wrong. Yesterday he suggested I change my will to make sure he would be taken care of if something happened to me. He said it would prove I was serious about our relationship, that I wasn't just stringing him along. I told him the apartment was already taken care of, that you would always have a place to live. But he said that wasn't enough, that a man needed security if he was going to uproot his entire life for love. I'm starting to wonder if I've been a fool, Sarah. What if Richard doesn't really love me? What if he's just been telling me what I wanted to hear because he sees an opportunity for financial gain?" The letter slipped from my hands. I looked at Sarah, who was watching me with an expression of growing dread. "There are more letters like this," she said quietly. "The closer she got to telling you the truth, the more worried she became about Richard's motives. In her last letter to me, she said she was thinking about calling everything off, about confessing to you and trying to rebuild your marriage instead." Her last letter, written just weeks before the accident that had killed her. "Sarah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I think Richard Coleman has been lying to both of us." Sarah and I spent the next 3 hours going through every letter in that box, laying out a timeline of Ella's relationship with Richard that painted a very different picture than the one he'd presented at the diner. What had started as rekindled romance had gradually transformed into something that made Ella increasingly uncomfortable. "Look at this one," Sarah said, handing me a letter dated 4 months before the accident. "She's starting to question everything." I read Ella's careful handwriting, my anger building with each word. "Richard called again today asking about the life insurance policies. He wanted to know exactly how much money we were talking about, whether there were any complications that might delay the payout if something happened to me. When I asked him why he needed to know such specific details, he said he was just being practical, that he wanted to make sure Sarah would be taken care of. But Sarah has the apartment, has her job, has everything she needs to be independent. Why would Richard need hundreds of thousands of dollars to take care of her? Unless he's not really thinking about taking care of her at all. I'm starting to realize that the Richard I fell in love with 33 years ago might not be the same man who's been calling me these past 2 years. Or maybe I've just been so lonely, so guilty about the lies I've been living, that I've been hearing what I wanted to hear instead of what he was actually saying. I set the letter down and looked at Sarah, who was systematically organizing the correspondence into chronological order. "How many letters are there total?" 47 to me, 31 to Richard, and 28 to you," she said without looking up from her work. But the interesting thing is how the tone changes over time. The early letters to Richard are romantic, hopeful. The later ones are cautious, almost fearful. Fearful of what? Sarah handed me another letter, this one dated just 6 weeks before Ella's death. I made a terrible mistake today. I told Richard about Stephen's retirement account, about the pension he'll receive when he stops working. Richard's reaction was immediate and intense. He wanted to know if there was a way to access those funds as part of a divorce settlement. When I told him that Stephen's retirement was Stephen's business, that I would never try to take money he'd earned through 40 years of work, Richard became angry. He said I was being naive, that I owed it to our future family to secure every advantage I could. That's when I realized Richard doesn't just want me. He wants the financial security that comes with me. He wants access to everything Stephen and I have built together, everything we've saved for our future. I told him I needed time to think. He said I'd already had 33 years to think, that it was time to act. The conversation ended badly, with him hanging up on me when I wouldn't commit to pursuing Stephen's retirement funds. I don't know what to do. I've created such a mess with my lies and secrets. I've hurt Stephen with my deception, I've confused Sarah about her future, and now I've apparently given Richard the impression that I'm some kind of financial windfall he can exploit. Maybe the best thing I can do is tell Stephen everything and let him decide whether our marriage is worth salvaging. Maybe honesty, even this late, is better than continuing to live a lie that's only getting more complicated. 6 weeks, I said, my voice hollow. She was planning to tell me everything 6 weeks before she died. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. And look at this. She handed me what appeared to be the last letter Ella had written, dated just 1 week before the accident. Stephen, if you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to tell you the truth about Sarah, about Richard, about all the ways I've failed as your wife. I know you have every right to hate me, to divorce me, to never speak to me again. I've lied to you for our entire marriage, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I need you to know that I've changed my mind about leaving you for Richard. These past few months have shown me that what I thought was love was really just guilt and nostalgia. Richard wants something from me that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with money and security. You, Stephen, have loved me for 35 years without asking for anything in return except honesty, the one thing I've never been able to give you. You've been faithful, kind, supportive, and patient even when I didn't deserve any of those things. I know it's probably too late to save our marriage. I know that learning about Sarah and the years of deception will hurt you in ways I can't undo. But I want to try. I want to tell you about our daughter and hope that your heart is big enough to love her the way I know you would have from the beginning. I want to introduce you to Sarah and see if we can build the family we should have had all along. As for Richard, I've decided to cut all contact with him. I've already begun the process of changing the insurance policies back to your name, where they should have been all along. The apartment will remain Sarah's, but everything else, the investments, the savings, the future I've been planning, that belongs to you. It's always belonged to you. I love you, Stephen. I've always loved you. I just haven't always known how to show it in a way that was honest and true. I hope it's not too late to learn. Your wife, Ella. I finished reading the letter with shaking hands, my vision blurred with tears I could no longer hold back. Ella had been planning to come clean, to choose me, to try to rebuild our marriage with truth instead of lies. She'd been planning to cut Richard out of her life entirely, but she died before she could do any of it. Stephen, Sarah said softly, the insurance policies Richard showed you, I don't think they're legitimate. If Mom was planning to change them back to your name, if she'd already started that process. I wiped my eyes and tried to think clearly. We need to call the insurance companies directly, find out exactly what policies exist and who the current beneficiaries are. What if Richard was lying about everything? What if there are no policies naming him as beneficiary? The possibility hit me like a revelation. What if Richard's confident demands at the diner had been based on forged documents? What if he was gambling that I wouldn't know enough about Ella's finances to challenge him? My phone buzzed with a text message. Richard's number appeared on the screen. Have you made your decision? I need an answer by tomorrow afternoon. Sarah's future depends on what you choose. I showed the message to Sarah, who read it with growing anger. "He's threatening you," she said. "He's trying to use me as leverage to get money he's not entitled to." I stood up and walked to the windows, looking out over the city where somewhere Richard Coleman was waiting for my response. He thought he held all the cards, thought he could intimidate me into giving up everything Ella had meant to leave me. He thought he could steal my inheritance and my daughter with a combination of legal threats and emotional manipulation. He was wrong. "Sarah," I said, turning back to her, "I need to ask you something important. If it turns out that Richard has been lying about the insurance policies, if there's no legal obligation for me to give him anything, what kind of relationship do you want with him?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. 2 days ago, I would have said I wanted to know my biological father, that I'd been waiting my whole life to meet him. But reading these letters, seeing how he manipulated Mom, how he's trying to manipulate you... She looked up at me with those green eyes that were so much like Ella's. "I don't want anything to do with someone who would exploit a grieving family for money. Even if he is your biological father. Being a father is about more than biology," she said firmly. "It's about showing up, caring about someone's well-being, putting their needs before your own. In 2 days, you've shown me more genuine care than Richard has in 32 years. The words hit me with an unexpected warmth. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. If I fight this, if I challenge Richard's claims, it might get ugly. He might try to turn you against me, might tell you things about me or about your mother that aren't true." "Let him try," she said with a fierce determination that reminded me startlingly of Ella. "I've spent my whole life wondering about my father. Now I know I already found him." I felt tears sting my eyes again. "You're sure about this? You're sure you want me to fight for the inheritance Ella meant to leave us?" "I'm sure I want you to fight for our family," she said. "The real family Mom was trying to create when she died." That evening, I called David Morrison, the lawyer who'd handled Ella's estate planning. When I explained the situation with Richard and the insurance policies, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Stephen," David said finally, "I reviewed all of Ella's insurance policies when I prepared her estate documents 6 months ago. There are no policies naming anyone other than you as beneficiary. If someone is claiming otherwise, they're either mistaken or lying." The relief that flooded through me was so intense I had to sit down. "You're certain?" "Absolutely certain. Ella specifically told me she wanted to make sure everything went to you, that she was changing some previous arrangements to ensure there would be no complications after her death." "Previous arrangements?" "She mentioned that she'd been considering some changes to her beneficiaries but had decided against it. She said she wanted to keep things simple, wanted to make sure her husband inherited everything without any legal challenges." Ella had kept her promise. In her final months, she'd chosen me, chosen our marriage, chosen the family she wanted us to be. Richard's documents were either forgeries or fantasies, his confident demands based on nothing but his own greed and delusion. "David," I said, "I need you to send a letter to Richard Coleman informing him that he has no legal claim to any part of Ella's estate. I want it delivered tomorrow morning. Consider it done. And Stephen, if he continues to harass you or makes any threats, we can pursue legal action for fraud and extortion." After I hung up, I found Sarah in the kitchen making dinner. A simple pasta dish that smelled like home in a way our house on Maple Street hadn't since Ella died. "Richard has no legal claim to anything," I told her. "The insurance policies he showed me were fake." Sarah's shoulders sagged with relief. "So it's over?" "The financial part is over. But Sarah, there's something else we need to discuss." I sat down at the small kitchen table, suddenly nervous about the conversation I was about to have. "What happens now? With us, I mean. Do you want to keep living here? Do you want me to sell the apartment? Do you want to try to build some kind of relationship, or would you prefer to just stay in touch occasionally?" She turned off the stove and came to sit across from me. "What do you want, Stephen?" The question caught me off guard. For 35 years, I'd been focused on what Ella wanted, what would make her happy, what would keep our marriage stable. I'd rarely asked myself what I actually wanted. I want a family, I said honestly. I want to learn everything about you, your interests, your dreams, your fears, your favorite movies and foods and books. I want to know what makes you laugh and what makes you cry. I want to be the father I would have been from the beginning if I'd been given the chance. Sarah smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her since this whole ordeal began. I want that too, but Stephen, I don't want you to feel obligated to take care of me because of some guilt about Mom's secrets. I want you to choose me because you actually want me in your life. I do want you in my life, I said without hesitation. Not because of obligation or guilt, but because you're smart and strong and kind, and because I can see so much of the best parts of your mother in you. I want you in my life because you called me Daddy, and it felt like coming home. We sat there looking at each other across that small table, two people who'd been strangers 48 hours ago, but who were choosing to become family despite all the pain and deception that had brought us together. There's one more thing, I said. I'm selling the house on Maple Street. Too many memories, too many reminders of a life that was built on lies. I want to start over somewhere new. Where will you go? I smiled. I was hoping you might help me find a place. Somewhere close enough that I can see you regularly, but far enough from Richard Coleman that we can build our relationship without interference. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. Outside the apartment windows, the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, Richard Coleman was waiting for an answer that would never come. Tomorrow morning, he would receive David's letter informing him that his claims were fraudulent, that his demands were legally baseless, that the family he'd tried to manipulate was stronger than he'd realized. But tonight, Sarah and I sat in the home Ella had created for her daughter, planning a future neither of us had imagined 48 hours ago. A future based on choice rather than obligation, on truth rather than deception, on the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return except the chance to grow. 3 months later, I stood in the living room of my new apartment, just 6 blocks away from Sarah's building, watching the morning sun stream through windows that had never known Ella's secrets or my old loneliness. The space was smaller than the house on Maple Street, but it felt infinitely larger. Room to breathe, room to build something new, room for the kind of honest life I'd never thought possible. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Sarah holding a box of pastries and wearing the kind of smile that had become precious to me in ways I was still learning to articulate. "Happy Father's Day," she said, stepping inside and setting the bakery box on my kitchen counter. "I know it's not official yet, but I thought we should practice." Father's Day. I'd spent 60 years never imagining I'd celebrate it as anything other than a son calling his own father. Now here was Sarah, choosing to mark the day with me, even though we'd known each other for less than 4 months, even though the legal adoption wouldn't be final for another few weeks. "You didn't have to do anything special," I said, though I couldn't stop smiling as I watched her move around my kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. "Yes, I did," she said firmly. "Do you know how long I've wanted to buy Father's Day gifts? 32 years, Stephen. I'm not missing this opportunity." She handed me a wrapped package, her eyes bright with excitement and nervousness. Inside was a framed photograph I'd never seen before. Ella holding a baby Sarah in what looked like a hospital room, both of them looking directly at the camera with expressions of pure love. "I found it in Mom's papers," Sarah explained. "She kept it hidden for all these years, but I think she always hoped that someday you'd get to see it, that someday we'd all be a family together." I stared at the photograph, seeing Ella as a young mother for the first time, seeing the baby who would grow up to become the daughter I'd never known I was missing. The image was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a glimpse of the family we could have been if Ella had been brave enough to trust me with the truth from the beginning. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling an envelope from her purse, "a letter from Richard." My stomach tightened. It had been 6 weeks since David's letter had informed Richard that his claims were fraudulent, 6 weeks since we'd heard anything from him. I'd hoped he'd accepted defeat and moved on with his life. I opened the envelope and read the brief, bitter message. "Sarah, your mother promised me a life that I'll never have because of Stephen's selfishness. I hope you realize that he's stealing your inheritance, keeping money that should have supported both of us. When you get tired of playing house with a man who never wanted you in the first place, call me. I'll still be here, still be your real father. Richard. I handed the letter back to Sarah, my jaw clenched with anger. Are you going to respond? I already did. She pulled out her phone and showed me a text message she'd sent. Richard, Stephen didn't steal anything. He inherited what Mom legally left him, and he's sharing it with me because that's what real fathers do. You spent 32 years not knowing I existed, and the past 3 months trying to use me to get money. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of father you would have been. Please don't contact me again. Sarah. I looked at her with admiration and pride. How does it feel? Finally telling him what you really think? Liberating, she said without hesitation. For years I built up this fantasy about my biological father, imagined that if I could just meet him, everything would make sense. Turns out the fantasy was better than the reality. She moved to the couch and sat down, curling her legs under her in a gesture that reminded me so much of Ella, it took my breath away. But I want to talk about something else, something more important. I joined her on the couch, noting the serious expression on her face. What's on your mind? The house on Maple Street sold last week, right? I nodded. The sale had closed 3 days ago, finally severing my last physical connection to the life I'd shared with Ella. The buyer seemed excited about updating it, said it had good bones but needed some modernization. How much did you get for it? $320,000. Why? Sarah took a deep breath. I want to talk about the money, all of it, the house sale, the insurance policies, the inheritance from Mom. I've been thinking about what's fair. My chest tightened with a familiar fear. Sarah, we've discussed this. Your mother left everything to me legally, but morally, you're her daughter. You have every right to— Stop, she said gently. That's not what I'm saying. She pulled a folder from her bag, the same kind of organized documentation that Ella had always favored. I've been doing some research, talking to financial advisors, thinking about what would actually be best for both of us. She opened the folder and showed me a series of documents. I want you to put most of the money into retirement accounts, Stephen. You're 60 years old and you need security for the rest of your life. I'm 32 with a good job and my own apartment. I don't need hundreds of thousands of dollars right now. I stared at the papers, my throat tight with emotion. Sarah, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Not because I don't want the money, but because I want something more important. She met my eyes with the same direct honesty that had characterized every conversation we'd had since that first day in her apartment. I want a father who isn't worried about money, who isn't guilty about inheritance, who can just focus on being my dad. The word hit me like it always did. Dad. Not Stephen, not Mr. Harrison, but Dad. The title I'd given up hope of ever earning. What are you proposing? Keep $400,000 for your retirement, she said, pointing to the financial projections she'd prepared. That's enough to supplement your pension and Social Security, enough to make sure you never have to worry about money for the rest of your life. Put $50,000 into a college fund for future grandchildren. Yes, I want kids someday, and yes, I want them to call you Grandpa, and give me $50,000 to put toward a house down payment when I'm ready to buy something bigger. I studied her calculations, amazed by the thoughtfulness of her planning. You've really worked all this out. I learned from the best, she said with a slight smile. Mom always said you were brilliant with financial planning. I figured I should try to think like you would. The generosity of her proposal left me speechless. She was essentially giving up 3/4 of an inheritance she was morally entitled to, just to ensure my financial security. Sarah, this is too much. I can't let you— You're not letting me do anything, she interrupted. I'm choosing to do this because I love you, because I want what's best for both of us, and because I know Mom would have wanted us to take care of each other. I set the folder aside and pulled her into a hug, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. Are you sure about this? Completely sure, but there's one condition. What's that? We used some of the money to take a trip together. Mom always talked about how much you wanted to go to Ireland, how you'd been planning that vacation for years, but never took it because you were always saving money for other things. Ireland. The trip Ella and I had discussed just days before her death. The vacation we'd never taken because there was always some reason to wait, some bill to pay, some repair the house needed. We could go this fall, Sarah continued, her voice growing excited. See the countryside, visit the castles, maybe research your family history. I looked it up, and Harrison is originally an Irish surname. We might be able to trace your ancestry, figure out where your family came from. The idea of traveling to Ireland with my daughter, of finally taking the trip I'd dreamed about for decades, felt like a kind of healing I hadn't known was possible. I'd like that, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I'd like that very much. Good, because I already started looking at flights. I laughed, the first completely joyful sound I'd made since Ella's death. Of course you did. You really are your mother's daughter. And yours, she said firmly. I'm yours too now. Later that afternoon, we walked to a small cafe near Sarah's apartment, the same route we'd taken dozens of times over the past 3 months. The routine had become precious to me. These regular moments of connection that didn't require explanation or justification, just the simple pleasure of spending time with someone I loved. As we sat at our usual table by the window, Sarah pulled out another envelope, this one bearing official letterhead. The adoption papers came through, she said, sliding them across the table to me. It's official now. Legally, officially, you're my father. I looked at the documents that made what had been true in my heart official in the eyes of the law. Sarah Elizabeth Harrison. My daughter, in every way that mattered. How does it feel? She asked, echoing the question I'd asked her about Richard's letter. Like coming home, I said honestly. Like everything I've been through, the lies, the deception, the pain. It was all worth it because it led me to you. She reached across the table and took my hand. Mom would be happy, you know. About us, about this. In her last letters, she kept talking about how much she hoped you and I could become a family. She said it was the one good thing that might come from all her mistakes. I thought about Ella, about the woman who'd kept so many secrets but who'd also given me the greatest gift I'd ever received. Despite all the lies, despite all the ways she'd hurt me, she'd also made it possible for me to become a father. Her deception had been wrong, but it had also led to something right, something beautiful. I forgive her, I said, surprising myself with the words. I forgive your mother for all of it, the lies, the secrets, the plans to leave me, because if she hadn't made all those choices, I never would have found you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She loved you, Dad. In her own complicated way, she really did love you. I know, I said, and for the first time, I truly meant it. And I love you. Not because you're hers, not because of guilt or obligation, but because you're you, because you're smart and kind and brave, and because you chose to be my daughter when you didn't have to. We sat there in comfortable silence, watching the late afternoon sun slant through the cafe windows, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of secrets and lies and had chosen to build something new together. My phone buzzed with a text from David Morrison. Retirement accounts are set up. Ireland Trip Fund is established. Everything's exactly as you and Sarah requested. Congratulations on the adoption. I showed the message to Sarah, who grinned with satisfaction. So it's really done, she said. New life, new family, new future. New everything, I agreed. And Sarah, thank you. For what? For choosing me. For calling me Dad. For giving me the chance to be the father I always wanted to be. She squeezed my hand. Thank you for choosing me back. Outside the cafe windows, the city continued its daily rhythm, full of people living their complicated lives, keeping their secrets, making their choices. Somewhere out there, Richard Coleman was probably still bitter about the inheritance he'd never actually been entitled to. Somewhere else, other families were struggling with their own webs of deception and disappointment. But inside that small cafe, Sarah and I sat planning our trip to Ireland, talking about the house she wanted to buy someday, making the kind of easy conversation that comes naturally to people who've chosen to love each other without conditions. I was 60 years old, starting over with a daughter I'd known for 4 months and a future that bore no resemblance to anything I'd planned. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like the beginning of the life I was always meant to live. Honest, open, built on choice rather than obligation. The inheritance Ella had left me wasn't just money or property. It was the chance to become the man I'd never had the courage to be. A father, a protector, someone who could love completely without fear of betrayal. And as I watched my daughter plan our adventures with the same meticulous care her mother had brought to her secrets, I realized that sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped in the most painful discoveries. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you actually needed. Sometimes the family you choose is more real than the family you're born into. And sometimes love really is enough to build something beautiful from the ashes of something broken.